Japan up close.
Well, until recently, cyber warfare used to be a science fiction or journalism term. Governments didn't recognize it at all. The reason was simply that according to international law, war is war, and it doesn't need to be reinvented. Legal principles such as non-aggression, right to self-defense, and even the concept of armed attack all exists already in international law. We also have the tried and tested laws of armed conflict, the famous Hague and Geneva Conventions. All this applies to cyberspace. So the rationale of the so-called like-minded group of liberal democracies, which of course includes Japan as an important member, was that it was better to not confuse the issue with a new description of war. So after all, it doesn't really make much of a difference if I blow up a power station with cyber means or with a bomb. Also, very often, cyber really will be used to support traditional military operations, like shutting off a radar station so a plane can fly in. However, I do also think that people sometimes underestimate how bad a maximum effort cyber war could be. I think it already is, and certainly will be, comparable to limited nuclear exchange. So, however, on the other hand, since at least 2014 or so, and maybe even longer, it is clear that there's such a thing as hybrid or gray zone warfare. And cyber warfare, in this case, is a very distinct thing. It includes a number of activities below the so-called threshold of armed conflict or outright war. Some of these activities are very intense espionage or even attempts to prepare the cyber battlefield by planting cyber weapons for later use. They can also be support for information operations, subversion, information warfare. Other activities are simply outright sabotage and destruction. Much of this activity is, however, not clearly attributable to states, and sometimes it pretends to be cybercrime or even cyber terrorism. The spate of ransomware attacks that we've seen worldwide are an example of this. Some of these activities are politically directed, although it's very hard to prove it, and might be part of a longer running cyber war campaign. We do have international law, and we have international humanitarian law, and the position of the like-minded states of liberal democracies is that it applies completely to cyber. But there are areas where we don't exactly understand how this works. So what I worry about most is that the liberal democracies, which are one block, and the authoritarian states, which are another block, are locked in a battle that is even more ideological than the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had one common nightmare that we were all worried about. One thing we were trying to all avert, and that was an accidental nuclear war. That was the common nightmare that we all shared. But now we don't have one nightmare, we have two nightmares. Democracies tend to be worried about cyber war, burned out critical infrastructure, throwing us back to the 1920s or Iron Age, depending on how gloomy you are. But the authoritarian states are much more worried about information war and their dreaded outcome of regime change. These two visions, these two nightmares are not aligned. And this lack of common nightmare makes negotiations very difficult. So Cold War arms control wasn't exactly easy to begin with itself, but at least it had one nightmare. Now we have two, and they kind of work against each other. And if we get this wrong, then the lights will go out in a major cyber war confrontation, or indeed the opposite will happen, so to speak. We lose the battle for the free internet, and it slips into a dystopian world where the lights never go out, where there's basically no free speech left. So I describe this in my book, The Darkening Web, at considerable length. So the problem very often when you look at international diplomacy is that those states who want to do something new seem to want to replace what we have now. They want to replace existing international law, very often weakening it, which includes, of course, also human rights law, and definitely changing what we know as the rules-based order of international affairs. They want to remake the international relations in their image, reflecting their values, and also values that are effectively very often at odds with the UN Charter as it is. On the other hand, you are right. There is sometimes a lack of imagination of what we could do in addition to what we have right now. How can we expand on where international law currently is and where it's currently unclear of how it applies to cyber? And this, the political will question, is paramount. sometimes the good ideas come from the wrong people, and that makes it very hard to start a new process. But I do agree that the traditional arms control is not sufficient to deal with the issue. And some of the new ideas that we've been having on how to solve this contradiction between totally new international law and reinventing everything and just sticking to the absolute letter of existing international law has come up in the last 10 years or so. And that is the development of norms of behavior, or so-called soft law. So these are political agreements on what we're able to do in cyberspace, but not yet in legal agreements. So they basically provide us an understanding of what is good behavior and what is bad behavior in cyberspace, or actually, as one used to say, these are rules of the road. If you think about driving, rules of the road of state behavior in cyberspace. So this is a new development in the last 7, 8 years. It kind of takes the in-between road between those who don't want anything to change and those who want everything to change. And this is a good agreed position, I think, and one that we should pursue. First of all, it's now clear that those who stated many years past that hybrid war inevitably leads to real world war have probably been proven correct. Hence, we have to be very careful of accepting a very high level of aggression occurring all the time, because in the end, it's going to end up in a shooting war. Hence, there's a lot of concern in East Asia with China. And I think it's justified concern, and it's important that China realize what the response has been to the Russian invasion. Secondly, Russia, under its current leadership, will probably not ever be able to have even a small minority coalition within the United Nations again. Its motives are now clear on the table. It is obviously heavily in breach not only of the norms of behavior that we've created, but also international law. And we've seen it in repeated votes in the United Nations General Assembly that it is completely isolated. Thirdly, however, the Ukraine war, and in particular also the response of the international community to it, has shown that efforts to build soft law norms of behavior coalitions in cyberspace work very well. So we have had a number of processes in the UN First Committee, for instance, such as the group of governmental experts, the open-ended working group, and others, which have sought to define these soft law norms of behavior in cyberspace. The UN group of governmental experts, for instance, defined 11 norms of behavior of states in peacetime. Because in wartime, we know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, because that's what we have, the international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. So that's clear. What was more difficult is what do we do in peacetime? And these norms of behavior help in particular for us to define what is good and what is bad, because, you know, cyberspace is new. So people were thinking, well, maybe this is just the new normal. This is what we have to accept. And by building up a coalition of countries that basically increasingly say it is bad to attack critical infrastructure in peacetime, you shouldn't attack cyber defenders, you need to support each other in serious cyber incidents and similar, you've built an understanding of what is simply good and bad behavior. And that has been instrumental in condemning, for instance, Russian aggression in cyberspace, but also other actors. And this realization is now becoming increasingly prominent in the like-minded group of democracies. And it also means that democracies are becoming much more comfortable in calling out bad behavior, pointing fingers, saying this nation is not being a trusted member of the international community. And this is also a new development. And this is all happening in between this area of treaty law, effectively, and completely new law that we talked about beforehand. So it's a new development that is very political, requires a fine touch, but it's also becoming clearly a reflection of popular opinion among states, what is good and what is bad. So the Ukraine war has effectively shown that there is now a universal shared opinion of what is good and bad behavior in cyberspace. And effectively, the international dialogue around norms of state behavior has helped contribute to that dialogue. So we basically now have a clear understanding of what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do in cyberspace as a result. Some activities have been relatively under the radar over the years. For instance, Japan has a very respected capacity building program for cybersecurity for developing economies look to Japanese professionals to help raise their skill level. But also directly in the foreign ministry, we have been seeing a lot more openness to talk about cyber incidents. And Japan has, in the last couple of years, also joined those nations that are actively calling out bad behavior by other states in cyberspace based on those violation of agreed upon norms that we talked about beforehand. So Japan has, for the first time in its history, and recently started to point fingers, starting to say that this country and that country shouldn't be doing this in cyberspace, that they have been that Japan has been a victim of cyber attacks, and therefore has contributed to this attribution framework that we desperately need, so we can prevent the slow, if you will, slide into conflict, this inadvertent escalation that occurs if we just tolerate hybrid conflict. Because as I said at the beginning, the biggest worry, which has been borne out by Russia's war with Ukraine, the biggest worry is that if we just tolerate all of the offensive cyber action going on, it will inevitably lead to actual war happening. And the only way to do that is to constantly push back, even at this gray zone and hybrid warfare occurrences that are espionage or small acts of sabotage that are happening underneath the threshold of war. And Japan, and particularly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has started to do that. And that's an extremely important contribution, because it is important to sometimes understand that what we're talking about is not simply the West. We're talking about the like-minded group of liberal democracies. And it's not a cultural issue concentrated in Europe or the North Atlantic. It's a general philosophical issue that all liberal democracies share. And therefore, Japanese voices are incredibly important in this dialogue. I think it's actually easy to underestimate how big the shift in diplomacy has been over the last couple of years. Diplomats are always very careful in pointing fingers at other states in describing aggressive behavior. And actually, until a couple of years ago, nearly no diplomacy service, so no Ministry of Foreign Affairs worldwide would do such a thing. So it was kind of unheard of. Americans didn't do it either. No Europeans would do it. This has changed, and Japan joined this group of states that attribute bad behavior relatively quickly. That is a big deal, because this effectively is the visible component of a coalition of democracies that are working closer together to defend against bad cyber behavior. And the most important component of that is not only improving your technical skills, military skills, intelligence skills, but also simply saying, this is bad behavior, we're not going to tolerate it. Because it's possible simply to, sit back, simply accept the attacks and not talk about it. That's what we've been doing for years. But the result is that the attacks keep on coming, the bad behavior gets worse, and we slowly slide into this armed conflict scenario, this actual war scenario. So being able to speak up is actually one of the most important things you can do to preserve peace. And Japan, as a absolutely key member of the like-minded group, has started doing that. And that is not a small thing, and I don't think we should dismiss it.
Japan up close.